Okay, so welcome everybody. Just to reiterate, we are recording and that recording is now in process. So welcome to this webinar. We're absolutely delighted to see you all. Just to introduce myself, my name is Professor Karen Broadhurst. I'm based here at Lancaster University and I'm co-director of the Centre for Child and Family Justice Research. And I am your chair for today. So I'll be trying to keep people to time and taking you through this incredibly interesting webinar that you've joined us for. So today's event is the first event in our Research Centre's new series, which is Global Innovation in Family Justice Systems. It also marks the launch of an outstanding piece of collaborative research. And as you'll see from the faces on the webinar, our researchers are with us today. Amazing piece of research that aims to improve the lives and experiences of Roma families involved with children's services. You'll see on the screen in front of you the front cover of this report. If you haven't read this report, can I recommend it to you wholeheartedly? Speaking personally, it's really advanced my understanding of the position of Roma migrants residing in the UK. It's an accessible but highly informative read. Okay, so there you go. It's available, Joanna, as a free download. So for those of you who haven't read it, there's no barrier to you one click away accessing this report. The report's based on an excellent collaboration between Lancaster University, Anglia, Ruskin University, Law for Life, which is now Advice Now. We're pleased to have Dada with us. And it has also, of course, made possible by the participation of professionals, but also, very importantly, Roma communities. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to our first speaker in a minute, who will set the stage with some opening remarks. But before I do that, I just want to say a few words about the chat. So you'll see that the chat is now open. You, during this webinar, don't have access to, well, you've probably already worked out, you don't have access to your microphone or your video, but you can post questions in the chat. And Sophie's here monitoring those questions, and you will get an opportunity to have some of your questions heard during the panel discussion. I also want to say that Joanna is going to take charge with Sophie of collating all of your questions, and we will come back to you with an email where we address those questions after the event, should we run out of time today. Okay, so it's a 2-hour webinar. We'll be finishing at 6. And I want to introduce our first speaker, who is Rosa. And Rosa will be explaining the importance of family in Roma communities and the importance of the research today. Okay, welcome, Rosa. Are
Hello.
you there? Hello?
Yes. Hello, can you hear me?
We can hear you. We can't see you. I'm just wondering if we can get your camera turned on or not. Rosa?
It should be on. I can see myself.
Okay. Rosa, we can see you.
Okay. I think we've still got the slide up, actually. So if the slide came down, we'd probably see Rosa.
Yes.
There we go.
Yes, that's fantastic. Thank you, Margaret. So Rosa, welcome. Rosa, I don't know if you want to just say a few more words about yourself before you set the stage for us today with your opening remarks.
Yes, so good afternoon, hello, hola, ahoy to everyone in the space. Thank you for making time on this afternoon to be here. I'm Rosa Cisneros. I'm not Denisa Ganin. And I am Spanish Roma and Serbian, and I'm also an artist and researcher. I do a lot with, I work at Coventry University, but I also have a film production company where I do a lot with my Roma families, but also other communities that are marginalized. And we look at using arts and culture to co-create materials, resources, films, but also to ensure that research and research that's happening in various universities is also considering the Roma voices, the Roma community, and thinking about integrity and ethical considerations when working with, in this case, the Roma families. I've worked a lot within real life experience of working and supporting children and families that have been separated. I've done some guest lecturing with social work. So if I say something that might not be quite right or is not very clear, do ask me. But also I'm coming from to this conversation from my lived experience, my academic hat, but also from a place of the body and how things feel. So having said that, I'd love to honor Denisa's voice and work. She was supposed to be here. She wrote a letter. That letter is in the report. It's the forward to that report. So if you haven't seen it, I strongly encourage you to download the report. And I'm going to read parts of her foreword, and I also will respond to some of the things she says so that it sets up the tone about dialogue. And today I hope that what we walk away with is understanding that there's a lot of love in our Roma families. There's a lot of layers, but also dialogue is key if we want to ensure that we can respect all of the voices that enter into this conversation, Roma and non-Roma. And there are many allies in the room as well that have a lot of experience. So I will now start with reading parts of Denisa's letter. And you forgive me, I'm on one device and then I'm looking with the letter here. So forgive me if I'm doing a bit of ping-ponging back and forth. So Denisa says, quote, I grew up in a very traditional Roma family in the Czech Republic, and I am from the Hungarian Lovári Roma group. My parents could not read and write. We spoke only Romanes at home, and I could not speak Czech properly until I was 6 years old. My greatest memory from childhood that I am fond of is seeing my parents helping other Roma people that needed help. I recall that my mother or father sometimes brought home a person or even a whole family to our home to give them food or even let them stay overnight with us. Those people were in need or in difficult situations, or they were just family members that came to see us and they had a long journey to go back home and stayed overnight with us. In our Roma language, we would say they brought home bocale manushen, hungry people. As a child, I quite liked it because we were never alone and I liked meeting new people. I was interested in their life stories. They were singing our Roma songs and taught me how to dance. I will never forget those people and their kindness and humility. I was educated in a mainstream school. That was unusual because most of the Roma children were placed in schools for children with special needs. Those children had no special needs. They were in those schools simply because they were Roma and society believed that Roma children belonged in schools for children with special needs. I was the only Roma child in the mainstream school. I was bullied every day, but it did not bother me because I knew when I came home, I would not be alone and I had people around me who loved me. As soon as I came home, all negativity at school was forgotten. Unity, humility, kindness, love, and support are the words that I learned as a child from my family and from other Roma people that I met in my childhood. Roma families are united. Family means everything to us. My family helped me not to think about bullying in school and provided a great sanctuary that helped me deal with the level of mistreatment experienced as a child. Family also provides security for Roma. When you are in trouble, you always know that you can rely on your family to help you. And I'll end there. You're welcome to read the rest of it in the report, but I would like to respond to some of the things that Denisa has written and shared with us. And I think this idea of love and kindness and unity and people always being around you is really important to us. That relationship with our families is everything. And there's something also about bullying that she touches on and the hunger. And while she's explaining that in a way where she's framing it that her family would help those people in hunger, I think that also speaks to the reality that a lot of our families do live in extreme poverty, whether they're in their home country or when they come here. And that's also part of that journey of why a lot of our families move around. And it's clear I'm not from the UK and I've lived in many countries, but I've been very fortunate, similar to Denisa, to go to mainstream schools, to go to university. And that hasn't been without struggle. And I think that this, the question of bullying is central to a lot of what happens for our Roma families, and not only our children, but also our older, the parents and the older generation, where every space, or most spaces we go into, there's an element of mistrust. There's an element of having to defend yourself and who you are. And that doesn't end only in school. That can be the hospital. That can be, and you know, as a child, I witnessed that when my mother would clean houses. I also come from a traditional family where my mother couldn't read and write, was married very young. I was the first girl to go to school and university. And I witnessed the struggle, but also the love my mom had, and for us as a family, but also for education. And I think Denise touches on that a little bit as well, that there is a desire, but there's so many barriers. There's so many things, people that get in the way. There's so many assumptions made about us. And access, I think we'll talk about access throughout the day. And I think the report beautifully highlights the challenges and barriers that Roma families face, but also allies face, and people who want to support but don't quite know how. And I love when Denise also described that there's lots of people in the house. And I always use that example that, you know, if you have a family who comes to a school or comes to a meeting or the hospital appointment, and you have 6 Roma families in the room with you, that's 6 people that are all invested in this one individual and trying to care, because they'll go home and discuss the care or what's happened. And so it's a very intra-generational way of being, which is not always standard, but that can be intimidating when you have a lot of people and bodies in a space. And so I think that if we can flip some of these things that feel overwhelming sometimes, and see that they come from a place of love, then I think we can maybe soften and be more open to a dialogue. There's so much more I could say. I'm not sure if I've gone over my allocated time, but I do encourage everyone to, it might sound woolly, but love and kindness can win, and it can move mountains. And so I think Denisa's letter in childhood is a great example of what's possible when certain permission is given to a community. So I'll stop there.
Lovely. Thank you, Rosa. And thank you so much for bringing Denisa into the webinar as well, and drawing on her letter as the forward to the report. That's excellent. Thank you so much also for the fascinating insights into your experience and helping us to better understand, as you say, the particular ways of being amongst Roma families. Okay, so I am now, without further ado, going to hand over to the research team. And by the way, Rosa, you were perfect, you were bang on time. So you set the stage very well in that respect as well. So I'm now going to hand over to the research team. And I want us to welcome Chantal, Joanna, our lovely Joanna, Melanie, and Sophie, and Dada, who have produced this fantastic piece of research, obviously alongside Margaret as well. So first up, I think Chantal, and some slides, please, from Sophie. Can I just also say, if you're wanting to post a question, use the Q&A function at the top of the screen. Can you all see that? There's a Q&A function, because I don't think everyone's got access to the chat. But if you put the questions in Q&A as we go along, we're monitoring that, and we'll pick up on your questions. Okay, Lisa, you can see it. So Lisa, can you see the Q&A? Yes?
I
Yes,
think it's
yes.
visible, so great.
Great.
Thank you. Melanie,
That's
could
great.
we have the slides, please?
Sorry.
Sorry,
Melanie.
yep.
Thank you, Melanie. So over to the research team.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to begin by giving you an overview of the methodology. So the project used a collaborative mixed methods approach with 6 key elements. First of all, we carried out a UK-based literature review examining the experiences of Roma families with children's services in England over the last 20 years. And we looked at existing publications, including academic articles and reports. Secondly, we reviewed relevant policies implemented in the last 15 years, including the Independent Review of Children's Social Care of 2022, the Community Cohesion Framework, and the impacts of austerity and Brexit on Roma families. The third main element was an online survey and interviews with social care and legal professionals who've worked with Roma families in England to explore how the families interact with children's services. So this was an online survey consisting of a mixture of closed questions and open text boxes to provide more detailed information. And the issues raised were then examined in greater depth through online semi-structured interviews, which took place from May to June 2023. And these were between 50 to 80 minutes long, and they were audio recorded and fully transcribed. The fourth element of the methodology was discussion groups with Roma community members, and we carried out 3 of these in Rotherham, Sheffield and Liverpool. Roma community members acted as co-facilitators of the groups, and the questions were shared with them in advance to review and refine. And the main aim of the groups was to explore the challenges that families face when interacting with children's services, and also to learn about positive experiences and models of good practice. These meetings took place face-to-face in June and July of 2023 and lasted between 60 to 90 minutes. And they were also audio recorded and fully transcribed. The fifth element was an analysis of child safeguarding practice reviews in England involving Roma families, involving a systematic search of the NSPCC National Case Review Repository. And the sixth key element was an analysis of the care proceeding cases involving Roma families. A search of the Lexis Plus portal database identified 16 cases, which were then followed up with a thematic analysis using NVivo software. Can we have the next slide, please? So the process of analysis consisted of taking the 6 methodological elements and first of all analysing them separately, which included analysis of the transcripts from the interviews and discussion groups, which were looked at and analysed collaboratively with 5 Roma champions. And all of these elements were then analysed collectively to identify both common and different themes. And finally, we organised an expert group workshop with 5 Roma and 8 non-Roma professionals to identify recommendations from the findings. Thank you very much. I'll hand over now to Joanna.
Thank you very much, Chantal. My name is Joanna Kostka, and thank you so much for listening to this presentation. And I really do encourage you to look at the report, because that's where you will find all the figures and all the sort of technicalities and the breadth of data. So I think our first really sort of focus was to really contextualize the experiences of Roma families within a broader policy context. We all come from this sort of belief that policies play a really important role in people's lives, and they can act as facilitators for good life, and they can also act as barriers. So we wanted to make sure that we do not just focus on individual people or individual practitioners, but really contextualize their interactions within a broader policy context. And we've done a detailed policy analysis and a literature review. And what we really found out is that the structural challenges related to poverty and racial inequalities play a tremendous role in making Roma lives more difficult, and in fact disproportionately impact Roma families when they come here to the UK. Next slide, please. So we're focused on structural barriers related to austerity, Brexit, and ongoing racial inequalities. We decided to focus on these policies because they're quite recent, but nevertheless, we obviously are quite aware of the historical marginalization and discrimination of Roma families. And you can read about that in our report, in our literature review. These are not new policies that target Roma. This has been going on for centuries, not only here in UK, but across Europe. So in terms of austerity, we focus on the way the last decade has definitely dismantled vital public services and safety nets for specifically designed for low-income families. Brexit, on the other hand, really complicated and disenfranchised a lot of migrants by making legal obligations quite ambiguous and confusing. And the ongoing racial inequalities, I mean, we have a lot of research showing that racialized minorities in these countries are disproportionately affected by in services, whether these are racialized communities that have been living here for a very long time, or newcomers such as Roma migrants who've been coming to the UK since probably early 90s. We did find that Roma have been impacted by both austerity and Brexit, and we show in our report how systemic racism amplifies the mistrust in services, the fear of services, and also ongoing exclusion from vital public services, including healthcare and education. And this is where Margaret will probably talk about during the panel. Can we have next slide, please? Austerity and poverty, we know, we're in the midst of a crisis. We see the rise in child poverty over the last 10 years. At this moment, we have probably more than 4.2 million children living in poverty in the UK. And for the country that is the 6th biggest economy in the world, that's really not something that we should be proud of. In fact, it's quite concerning. And we do know there's quite a lot of research that we draw on that austerity measures introduced in 2010 led to the most substantial cuts to public spending since World War II. And now you can look at these figures in the report, but just to give you the sort of big number, is just in the last 8 years, £7 billion were cut from for services targeted at young people. And the consequences are absolutely atrocious. We still see them now. We see families struggling, particularly in the north, but also across the country. And again, Roma migrants who come to this country, who already been struggling socioeconomically and already been struggling with accessing services, and these policies only amplify their poverty, mostly because they face precarious living conditions, precarious jobs, and extremely limited access to any types of support. Just to let you know, for example, overcrowded housing is one of the biggest issues, which the census have showed us as well. And this leads to different types of exploitations, vulnerabilities, and of course puts children at a greater risk and a greater chances to interact with social services. Can we have another slide, please? Now, after Brexit, the immigration policy has changed quite drastically for EU citizens and EU third nationals. One of the biggest policy that has been, criticized by the entire community, by social workers, by legal practitioners, is the no recourse to public funds, part of the hostile environment, a policy that prevents the most vulnerable people from accessing housing benefits, universal credits, and other welfare support. Now that policy is in direct conflict with Section 17 of the Children's Act. Our local authorities must support children in need and must make sure that no child is left behind. Now, this creates a lot of confusions. I hope we can talk about this later on, maybe in the panel. Nevertheless, we have a lot of solicitors here, a lot of charities, and I'm pretty sure that every practitioner knows how difficult that is to sort of offshore the responsibility on the local authorities and not and put children and families in even greater risk. Of course, there's a fear of deportation, which deters any sort of engagement and seeking support. So a lot of families are very afraid from seeking support, even emergency medical support, which only adds to the complexity and the risks and the awful treatment that people face trying to make a living in this country. Next slide, please. So we are, I think as a team, we are convinced that structural poverty drives care placement. We have enough data to prove that. The center, our center, has done a lot of research. The Newfield Foundation done a lot of research, and we do know that children are entering care due to deprivation and poverty, not parenting failures, and that's simply not great. This is a serious issue. We continue to confuse poverty with neglect, and that is definitely never ever a reason to remove a child from struggling family. And if we don't address that on a structural level, we will keep seeing a quite drastic ways of family separations that never bring any good to the welfare of the people involved. Next slide, please. Unfortunately, racial poverty and systematic inequalities are also part of daily life in UK. Again, there is extensive research demonstrating this. Austerity only has deepened existing racial inequalities, with Black and Asian households losing income up to 20%. Cuts to education and integration programs and preventive programs and community support programs also exaggerated that racial gap and caused more discrimination and more vulnerabilities for people affected. And again, we see that Roma migrants in particular, who often do not have qualifications, do not have access to meaningful employment, are the biggest, suffer these consequences. That combined with negative stereotypes, what Rosa talked about, and ongoing and perplexing, really, systemic racism in all services we encounter, contribute to even harsher scrutiny of Roma families, even harsher risks, and also intervention by social worker. This sort of hyper surveillance that instead of sort of bringing hope and help, it brings penalizing consequences. And this is what is really visible in the policy landscape. And I think Dada will talk about this from the Roma family perspective. Can we have another slide, please? And, we do know that, we have research to substantiate that, and yet policies are still very, very sluggish to address it. We reviewed that independent review of children's social care, which doesn't really mention poverty as one of the main or primary driver of care placement. We sort of missed an opportunity to talk about racial inequalities and even mentioning of Roma, whether we're talking about Roma with the migrant backgrounds or indigenous Roma populations and traveling people who live in this country for centuries. These policies still don't really put that at the center of the discussion. And without these reforms, without community-based services to support families in crisis, training and social work or cultural competencies is not enough. We really need to think in a very structural manner, and without addressing poverty and systemic racism, we are absolutely convinced that policy reforms will fail to achieve equity. Next slide, I think it's the last one from me. So structural issues matter. There must be addressed. We must talk at the political level. We must pressure politicians and policymakers to make substantial changes to what is happening on the ground. I think Roma across Europe have been calling for that change, for this political engagement with policies. And I think this report also shows that those changes are absolutely needed here in the UK. And I pass over now to, I believe, to Melanie. And please, if you have any questions regarding policies or regarding the analysis, please put them in Q&A and I will help to be able to address them all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joanna. So I'm going to give some feedback from the findings which came through the survey and the interviews. So looking at the survey findings, we appreciate that numbers were small that completed the survey, but I think it's important to remember we weren't necessarily looking for representative views, but to really kind of give us some insight to what the main issues were, which we were then to follow up in the more in-depth interviews. So the main challenges that were identified from the social care and legal professionals when working with Roma families, perhaps not unsurprisingly, were issues around trust, language barriers, which then affects Roma families' knowledge and understanding of child protection processes, and also along with that entrenched cultural misunderstandings, but on both parts as well. Social care professionals also identified how the transient lives of some Roma families could impede developing effective relationships. Whilst from the legal professionals' background, they highlighted distinct challenges around court hearings now being online, which were negatively impacting Roma families, and the challenge of finding suitable interpreters and experts. Other challenges raised by the respondents was that most didn't believe Roma culture was being supported for Roma children in care, and all respondents considered that the experiences of Roma families and children's services needs to be improved. There were, however, some good models of good practice identified by both social care professionals, and these related to the pivotal role of establishing trust. Whilst for legal professionals, the emphasis was more placed on improved cultural awareness and respect as being essential to facilitating fair and effective interactions. So looking now at the interviews, the broad themes for the survey were then followed up into greater detail in the in-depth interviews, and in total we undertook 6 interviews, 3 of whom were with social workers, and one of these occupied a dual role. 2 participants had a dual role with their legal and community expert roles, and we also had 1 community expert taking part. But all participants had direct experience of working with Roma families within the context of child protection. So looking at the findings around Roma families' experiences with children's services, echoing the survey findings, most participants believed Roma families' experiences in children's services was poor. And this was put down to direct discriminatory practice, which all participants provided a number of examples, sometimes, as this first quote illustrates, around the labelling and othering of Roma families that frequently went on. Discriminatory practice was linked to wider negative and stigmatizing societal attitudes towards Roma, which then, as the second quote illustrates, is played out often in a practice capacity. And unsurprisingly, participants identified how initial engagement with Roma families, they would be met with mistrust and fear, as this last quote nicely highlights. Interviews with further findings around Roma family experience was a key theme that came through from the interviews was participants witnessing a kind of speeding up and an escalation of Roma cases in comparison to other groups and communities. And once Roma children entered children's services, as identified also in the survey, Roma culture was not maintained or indeed encouraged, as this last quote does highlight. There are numerous barriers to positive engagement identified, and most of these echoed what we were finding from the survey, this being around language barriers, issues in using interpreters, which could lead to misunderstandings and assumptions. And despite social workers perhaps believing they had fully informed Roma families about their case and expectations, the participants did speak about how many Roma families are not necessarily feeling fully informed about what is going on, and so as a result might not attend appointments or make the desired changes, which then leads to the label of non-engagement. And a fourth barrier identified related again to the issue of culture misunderstandings, again on both sides. And finally, it was highlighted how for social workers, issues of mistrust was impeding that initial engagement with Roma families. And from a practice perspective, high caseloads and the loss of reflective spaces was really negatively limiting opportunities to examine and challenge misunderstandings and assumptions. So the models of good practice identified 5 main themes came through. And these were the value in engaging with Roma history, culture and organisation. And this was really seen as pivotal to aiding understanding. Many participants spoke positively about engaging with Roma groups and organisations and how this very often acted as a bridge to build effective relationships with Roma communities. The second model of good practice identified was around the need for early intervention as the best way to support Roma families, with appropriate supports being put in place, and as a way to avoid escalation in those cases where it is unwarranted. And to strengthen and build trust with Roma families, a number of participants spoke of the need for transparency and also reliability in all their interactions to enhance the issues, to enhance trust between them. And finally, by always following through with things that have been agreed to be done and being respectful and curious, further consolidated trust, and again was seen as crucial when it came to positive outcomes for Roma families. So a whistle-stop tour of the key findings, which are obviously discussed and presented more in depth in the report. But I'll now pass over to Sophie, who's going to talk about findings found in the care proceeding cases.
Hi, everybody. I'm just going to speak very briefly right now about the element of the research, which was looking at the legal cases on the Lexis Plus database. So we used inclusion criteria to search the Lexis Plus database and treated any judgments that came up, and these were predominantly for care and supervision proceedings and adoption proceedings relating to Roma families, as a source of data that was then thematically analysed so that we could understand a little bit more about the judicial reasoning of the courts, the approaches of judges, and the barriers that parents experience when navigating the processes from a legal perspective, treating the information in the judgments as data. And from that, we pulled out some key trends. First of all, speaking about the backgrounds of the parents, it was very common. So in 6 of the 9 cases where they did specify the mother's age was not specified in every case. The mother was under 20 years old. So we're looking at very young parents in this instance, who, when you're 20 years old, you've not sort of developed your parenting skills in the way, and you need a little bit more support. So we're looking at young mums here. And then when we're thinking about the systemic issues related to access to welfare benefits, the hostile environment, no recourse to public funds, in 5 out of the 16 cases, it was explicitly mentioned that parents were living either in poverty or they were struggling to access welfare benefits or adequate accommodation. So in these cases, their social rights were really infringed, and it's not clear how much support they were given in order to access these necessities either. In further compounding that, in additional 6 of the cases, it was mentioned that the parents had complexities with their migratory status, and that included parents who were survivors of trafficking and modern slavery. In terms of the reasons for the child protection interventions, the most frequently cited concern was neglect, which featured in 9 of the 16 cases, and that ties back to the policy findings that Joanna mentioned earlier, and also the fact that a lot of the parents struggled to access the necessary social rights needed for providing an adequate standard of living to their children because of barriers that were systemic. Physical harm was identified in 4 cases, but that ranged from over-chastisement through to serious physical harm. And then looking more widely at the barriers for parents in proceedings that were mentioned in the judgments, it was generally a mistrust of the system, especially towards social workers. And that could lie in lots of different things, which will be unpicked from the perspective of the Roma families in later sections. In 4 of the 16 cases, it was found that parents lacked litigation capacity, but it's not clear how accurate these assessments for capacity are, because it's widely reported by the European Commission and other monitoring bodies that in country of origin, Roma parents or Roma children are often placed in special schools, not because of any difficulties that they have with comprehension or with mental capacity, simply because they're Roma. So it's not clear how that's reflected when people come to the UK and engage in these proceedings. Other practical issues were around scheduling and finances, ability to attend hearings, necessity and need to work during times when hearings were scheduled. And other barriers included translators and interpreters. There were instances in which the interpreters were speaking Slovakian, for example, instead of Romanesque, and it's not clear to what extent the parents were consulted on the language of their preference. And then one of the last big trends that came out of it was transfer requests. In 16 cases, there were transfer requests in which the parents asked for the court cases to be heard in country of origin rather than the UK. In 8 of the cases, parents expressed that country of origin would produce better outcomes for them. And that was for a number of reasons. That's because the UK has a practice of non-consensual adoption, which other countries do not have. The availability of support from family and community in country of origin where they may reside, alternative carers such as grandparents, for example, and the removal of systemic barriers. Parents often thought that they would encounter better cultural competency in the country of origin than they would in this country, despite persecution that they may have already faced there. And so we work together, it's not in the report, but we work together with Denisa, who's been mentioned already today in the introduction, who's a wonderful advocate and Roma solicitor. And we wrote down some recommendations for legal professionals, which are available on the Family Law Week website in an article, which we can post and share in the chat and share after this. And broadly, those recommendations are around the building of trust and lawyers ensuring that they create systems of trust by explaining things very clearly and empowering parents. They ensure that there's access to culturally competent interpreters, instructing Roma experts for culturally competent assessments, and ensure fair culturally competent assessments of litigation capacity for the reasons that I've earlier mentioned, and then being flexible with approach to parents where you meet them and when you meet them and coming to them on their terms. So we'll put that in the chat for you to look at. And I'm now going to pass on to Dada, who's going to talk about engaging Roma families in the research.
Thank you, Sophie. This is the last section, and then we will just share recommendations at the end. So Chantal already explained what we did. We did these discussion groups in 3 locations. I'm just going to add that we transcribed all these discussion group meetings, and then we collaboratively analyzed them with 5 Roma advocates. That ethos of involvement of Roma advocates in our research was there throughout our research. Can we have next slide, please? I'm just going to share some of the findings, and they're around the perceptions of children's services amongst Roma families, the barriers that they face when they engage with children's services, and their experiences. And finally, I'm going to share some of the good models that Roma parents appreciated and found helpful. So in terms of perceptions, overwhelmingly, most parents were scared of children's services, of engaging with social workers. And that fear was very well established in the communities. I can't overemphasize how much people spoke about that. And the stories about negative experiences with children's services were shared within the communities through storytelling. And then affecting even parents who have never had involvement with children's services themselves. And that fear was also connected to a sense of powerlessness and the lack of control that, over this kind of situation and what is happening in their lives. And that's very nicely exemplified in the quote on this slide. Okay, can we have next slide? In terms of barriers, a very significant barrier in positive engagement with social workers was parents' lack of awareness of the processes, child protection processes, and also their rights. So legal capability very much affected the way they engage with children's services, and they were very much describing that kind of lack of knowledge creates a very significant power disbalance between them and social workers. And to connect it to that were people's sort of sense that social services, social workers were expecting too much of them. And that's very much, we believe, connected to the socioeconomic circumstances of many Roma families, which is something that Joanna talked about in the first section of this presentation. And I must say that people very frequently talked about stuff that really they found very challenging, and one of them were unannounced visits. That's something that repeatedly people talked about. It's something that really struggle with, people just turning up and at their doors. And then also social workers looking through people's houses and checking cupboards and opening fridges were mentioned by many people. And so I thought it would be worthwhile highlighting that was something that Roma families struggled with a lot. And you have this very, very poignant, powerful quote on the slide as well. Can we have next slide? What we found as well in our discussion groups is that people shared knowledge about the process in our discussion groups, and that in a way showed that legal empowerment is really important within the communities. And another thing that we noticed is that those Roma parents who had access to either support organizations, community groups, or Roma activists to help them through this process seemed a lot more empowered to challenge practices that they perceived as poor, or to ask for change, for example, change of interpreter. And so again, that highlights the importance of community support and trusted intermediaries in this process. Can we have the next slide? In terms of barriers, one of the most frequent challenges that people talked about is around communication, and in particular use of interpreters. A lot of Roma parents talked about interpreters who were not from Roma origin not using their first language, so speaking via interpreters who could speak second or third language of the families, and how that impacted on the engagement with children's services. And that's probably felt both ways from social workers' perspective as well. Another really significant thing they mentioned is that some interpreters also had prejudiced views about Roma families, and that again really impacted on the quality of engagement. Can we have next slide? Some participants also, in terms of experiences, they felt that their cultural norms and the way of living, way of doing things were not understood correctly. So, for example, practices around food, like what kind of food is prepared, the way the food is prepared, the way that mothers feed the infants. These kind of examples came repeatedly in our discussion groups. Then this sort of open door culture in Roma communities, people often felt was misunderstood, often by officials and including social workers. So they felt very much that it was suspicious. The atmosphere in their houses were often misinterpreted as suspicious, whereas it's a completely normal way of living amongst Roma families. Okay, and also living conditions. Again, like a lot of families talked about, being judged for the conditions they are able to provide, and being judged for not being able to provide certain ways of living that was, so to speak, expected of them. So that was another issue that was mentioned a lot. Can we have a next slide? The experiences with children's services, many Roma families felt that they were treated differently because of their ethnicity, and they had doubts that the same rules applied to the other non-Roma families, and that's very much described in the quote on this slide of a mother whose child was hurt in a school, and that child ended up in A&E being examined, and social workers then came to their house and checked their house. And the final of this quote, the end of this quote is quite sort of, telling, that the social worker, when after doing all the investigation, said, you are a good family. And the mother who spoke to us in the discussion group said, I felt like I was some kind of exception, which is not the way it should be. Okay, the next slide, please. Yes, some families challenged the way that the system looked after Roma children in care. Parents that we had in our discussion group, they talked about, these Roma children that ended up in care having really poor outcomes in life, and they were, so to speak, puzzled by how was that an alternative, a better alternative to these children being raised in their own families. We didn't like go into specific circumstances of these children, obviously, but they just were very puzzled by the way the system looks after Roma children. And they also mentioned that once the children are in care, there is sort of almost complete breakdown from their culture, from their language. And that's very much present in our findings through the consultation with social workers and lawyers. Another really important finding is around a lack of placements, foster placements within Roma communities. There's a complete absence of foster parents from Roma background. And when we asked parents about kinship care as an option, it was either that people were not aware of that, or they felt that what they have will not meet the standards of and expectations of children's services, or some parents even felt that by putting themselves forward, they will end up being investigated themselves. So kinship care as an option was not explored by many parents, and that's probably evident in data and numbers as well. Can we have the next slide? In terms of good practice, I must say that a lot of parents did share positive things about social workers. So not everything was entirely negative. They did talk about positive experiences, and positive experiences were linked to social workers who have positive attitude, who are, encouraging of the progress that the families are making, who are engaging and having respectful kind of attitude towards families, who will, sit down and share a cup of coffee with Roma parents, who will accept the refreshments prepared by Roma parents. And then on the next slide, we have some few more examples. Very importantly, social workers who modeled behavior, who had this pragmatic approach of showing how the changes that they are expecting or they think should be made are made. So they're not social workers who just tell you must do that, but showing how these changes can be made and modeling good practice. That was very much appreciated by the parents. Another really important good practice model was around social workers who provided access to important services such as health services or welfare support. A lot of Roma parents struggle to access public services, including important health services. They don't understand how system works, or they have communication challenges, or they don't know how to go about the things. So they really appreciated social workers who helped them access important services that, helped them provide better standard of care for their children. And finally, they really, really appreciated social workers who took time to explain processes, who explains to Roma parents, what the concerns are, how, why, and how they would like the changes to be made. So that was another really important sort of positive kind of model that they appreciate. And all these things, that I mentioned, really impacted on the quality of engagement, and would sometimes ending in some very, very positive interactions with children's services, and therefore, leading to positive outcomes for their families and their children. Okay, and I'm going to now finally hand over to Joanna, who's going to very briefly share some of our recommendations. And I must say that each of these recommendations have a lot of action points. So do have a look in our report what we recommend each of these recommendations should mean. Okay, over to you, Joanna.
Thank you very much, Dada, and thank you everyone for such great presentations. I won't spend a lot of time here. I just want to highlight that we really thought about these recommendations. I don't think they're naive or just sort of ticking boxes. I think they're all actionable, and as a collective, together with academics, professionals, people involved, people with lived experience, we can really create a positive change by addressing these issues. So it's really important to remember that these recommendations have been done collectively. And I really appreciate if you guys put comments and questions on chat, because if we're going to do this and if we're going to change something, we have to do it together. Legal professionals, social workers, academics, charity workers, advocates, and of course, fabulous Roma communities that bring so much strength and richness into England and European lives. So first, we need an enhanced data collection on Roma migrants. Data is atrociously underdeveloped in England. We group people together who should not be together. We don't have data on Roma migrants, pretty much, you know, very little, plus different institutions, different departments collect data in a different manners. What this means that often Roma migrants disappear from the analysis. I know the GRT community, there's a reason why we sort of champion these communities together, but when it comes to policy change, when it comes to unique barriers people face in accessing services, in interacting with public services, we need ethnically disaggregated data that is designed at a centralized level and that can be used to create better policies, better services, and can actually help everyone else building a better services for everybody. We need to include a comprehensive Roma inclusion strategy. We had one after Brexit that sort of disappeared. So there is a blueprint for such integration policies, such Roma inclusion strategy that we should be working on. Incorporating Roma people as a priority target group. Roma people disappear from mainstream policy analysis a lot of times. I mean, scholars who are determined to bring their voices to policymakers are quite few, and you know, they put an amazing battle trying to bring these people to the attention of policymakers, but we still need to do much more when it comes to analyzing and including Roma people as a priority, not as an afterthought, not as an orientalized being. We need to embed culturally competent approaches in Roma families and in children's services, and that has to be done on a structural level. We cannot just expect social workers to take more work onto themselves. We need to think of this strategically, and this is where academic community comes as well, to try to design ways in which our social services are more representative of the communities we live in. I mean, we're a very multicultural country, we're a very diverse and rich country, and that richness needs to be reflected, including having more Roma social workers, including having stipends for Roma to join universities, to join different professions, legal professions and whatnot. We need to improve engagement with Roma families through education and training. We need to ensure cultural continuity and family connection for Roma children. I think that should be a separate webinar because losing your connection with your culture is probably the biggest harm we can do to a child. Especially early on, and we do this in this country often and way too often, and there are ways to prevent that, and there's a lot of professionals, a lot of people who work with communities who have ideas of how to prevent this and how to incorporate a better system. Empowering work. You know, we need preventive social work. We need community social work. We need social workers to be part of the community. We need services to be part of the community. And that's that policy, politics, structural level we really need to address. And of course, we need to improve legal help to ensure legal professionals can support Roma families appropriately. We need to learn from Roma people. All of us, we need to learn. We can't just, you know, act as experts without actually listening attentively and bringing on board the things people are saying, because people know that they're being discriminated. People know that their lives are being challenged, and they know that the policies are not treating them equitably, and we need to listen and together come up with strategies to change that. So thank you very much. This is the end of our presentation. Please comment on chat, and we will answer all questions and collect all the comments. And now we move on to the panel, and Karen, I give it back to you.
Thank you, Joanna, and thanks to the research team for a thoroughly passionate and engaging set of presentations. I don't think I've sat through anything recently that's gripped me quite as much as that. And I can see from the exchange in the chat, there's quite lively discussion going on here, which we'll come back to. Okay, so researchers from Lancaster and Anglia Ruskin, Law for Life, Thank you. Extremely great set of presentations. So now we're going to move into a panel discussion, which I think we've heard a lot. We've learned a lot. And this is an opportunity for us to try to deepen our understanding. We've got a fantastic lineup of people for you here on the expert panel, and we're going to dig into some issues and questions a bit more deeply. So we've got half an hour for the panel, and then we're going to open up to an open discussion and Q&A for the last 25 minutes. Okay, so can I welcome, please, Margaret and Theresia? Theresia, are you there? I can't see Theresia. We've got Rosa, and we've got Alison Humes. Rosa, Alison Humes, and Margaret. Joanna, can you just confirm for me, is our fourth panel member unable to make it today? Joanna?
Yes, this is, so Theresia should be here. I actually see her on the list. I'm not sure. Oh, there she is.
There she is. Oh, well done.
Okay. Theresia, welcome. Theresia, are you able, and Rosa, to get your cameras on? Yes, lovely. Then we can see you. It's always a bit tricky with technology, defies us just when we need it. Okay, so look, I'm going to make a start while you're seeing if you can get that camera to work, Theresia. But welcome to panel members. And what I'm going to do to start with is just ask you to introduce yourselves very briefly and tell audience a little bit about who you are. So Margaret, I'm going to start on my top left. You're the first person on my list.
I'm probably the least important person in this panel, actually, so I feel really honoured to be here with our incredibly experienced and wonderful community representatives and members with all their expertise. So I'm Margaret Greenfields. I'm a Professor of Social Policy based at Anglia Ruskin University. I've been privileged, and it is the word, to work with Romani traveller and Roma communities for over 30 years now, quite amazingly. My PhD over 20 years ago was on child protection engagements with traveller communities. Yeah, and I sense have acted, I suppose, more as a sort of background advisor and critical friend and involved around this research project rather than doing a lot of the heavy lifting, but I have been involved in all aspects. Oh, and I was a lawyer initially, I forgot to say as well. I started off doing family law, housing law and immigration law before moving into legal policy and ultimately becoming an academic. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you, Margaret. So huge experience to bring you to this panel, which is great. Rosa, we've already met you, we've already listened to you, but please do say a few additional words that we didn't give you time for before.
Yes, also very grateful to be here and to sit amongst so many very incredibly talented, intelligent, loving individuals. And yes, I'm an artist and researcher. I work at Coventry University. I do a bit of consultancy work. I make films, co-create films and artwork, and my training is also in dance, so that's why I often think about the body and how research or how things might feel for individuals involved in projects or this kind of academic work. So yes, thank you.
Thank you, Rosa. Alison, can I come to you next, please?
Yes, hello, thank you. And I just want to thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel. And again, I feel really honoured to be in such wonderful company with such wonderful women. So I'm a Welsh Romani gypsy. My family's place of standing, where we will call home, has been Wales for over 350 years. Our migration route was through the Balkans and through Spain. So our tribe is Calais. Calais because we're Welsh gypsies and our migration route is through Spain. And again, that's there is so much. We talked about the complexity earlier, and we heard about the complexity in those underneath that umbrella term of GRT, which we hate as community members we hate, because we self-identify according to our tribes, which are really important to us. And I'm a qualified social worker. I've been a social worker for 25 years now. I'm now a social work academic, but my career has been as a social worker. I've been a child protection social worker. I've supported Roma, Romani and traveller families directly, families who've been involved in children's safeguarding and child protection. I also am one of the founder members of the Romanian Traveller Social Work Association, the first of its kind. And again, I think it was Joanna that was talking about the importance of diversifying our profession, our social work profession. We are as rare as hen's teeth. There simply are not enough of us in the profession, so we need to see more Roma social workers in the profession, but also on a personal level in terms of lived and living experience. My mother and my aunts were forcibly removed by the state in the post-war period. They grew up in a children's home. They were never considered for fostering or adoption because they were the gypsy children, and you didn't adopt or foster gypsy children. And we live with the pebble that was dropped in the pond. Those ripples are still they're still moving out across the pond, and again the research talked about the importance of trauma-informed approaches when we're supporting Roma families who have that history. So that's a little bit about me.
Lovely, thank you, Alison. I think we've lost Theresia again, Joanna.
Yes, I think she's having some problems with her internet.
Okay.
Unfortunately, so I'm just gonna quickly introduce her in her own words in case she joins us later on. So Theresia is a Hungarian Roma born in Romania. Is a dedicated and experienced educator, human rights consultant, advocate, and a peace activist with over 15 years of hands-on experience. She's a founder of Care for Young People's Future and Welcoming Cultures in UK. She specializes in supporting underserved communities such as Roma people, people with disabilities, refugee and asylum seekers, excelling in monitoring, reporting, and consulting on human rights issues. So a superhuman, in other words. Her experience spans inclusion and learning, service, migration, cohesion, family law, and protected characteristics. So I really hope she will be able to join us a little bit later on, and I will keep an eye on her, and it would be lovely to hear from her.
I agree, Joanna. Okay, let's keep an eye on that. Okay, so I'm going to turn to the panel now and just ask you, each of you in turn, for a sort of key reflection on the research. So Rosa, I'm going to come to you first, and just, what's uppermost in your mind in listening to this study?
There's so much I want to say. I appreciate the way the research team has carried out the research. There was a lot of integrity there, a lot of care, and I keep coming back to that because it is central to being able to find tangible recommendations, which clearly were outlined, and also to celebrate and honor the Roma families that did get involved, and also to highlight some positives, because I think it can be a very grim way of this topic can be very heavy, and it is very heavy, and it is very serious. But I'd like to, I think, point out two things. At one point, they said the survey numbers were a bit low, but I also would like to maybe frame that a little bit as an outsider. Those numbers might seem low, but this is also a very a project that's pushing boundaries and opening up topics. And so the level of engagement that they did have, I think, really speaks to the research team and the importance and the relationship that's been an ongoing, and that is something that's really important when we're doing this kind of work. How do you ensure that you're not helicoptering in, but really trying to develop and have a relationship? And the other point was, there's a lot of heaviness that our families experience, but that's so normalized for them from a very young age. So to come and to have an overcrowded home, and to think that they can advocate, or someone would advocate on their behalf, is just not really on the family's radar. So that, I think, was important to highlight, that these are things that for us as outsiders might feel or might seem like overcrowding, but for some of the families that's just a way because of the harsh reality. And the other, I want to end on a positive. I like to say that we can, I don't want to autopsy the problems, but also think about the solutions. And I think that the project did that with the recommendations that also seem very accessible. And the fact that we have those recommendations, it's not omitting the difficulties that are there, but it's saying, well, here's what you can actually do, and here's some steps. And also it's a call to action. And I think that's really important. A lot of the work I've seen, whether I've been supporting families or, you know, supporting young social workers or navigating that world with missing children and human trafficking, you know, there's a lot of, our families are often putting out fires. And this idea of long-term thinking or investing in a future that could be different isn't always there. And so I think that that's also really beautiful, that the project was taking this very hard reality and saying, well, this is what we also need to strive for, but this is the immediacy of what we can do. So I'll stop there. I'm sure other people have that.
Thank you, Rosa. Thank you. And yeah, I agree with you. I think the research team did refer to small sample sizes, but actually I was really impressed by the breadth of this study and the different sources of data and the way that they've navigated the research in terms of care and integrity, as you're saying, Rosa. Okay, so Alison, I'm going to come to you next for, you know, what's uppermost in your mind in terms of reflecting on this report?
Yeah, I think I want to congratulate the researchers first and foremost for, you know, for the approach that they've taken, and I think it reinforced to me the importance of taking that intersectional lens.
Yeah.
Which they absolutely have done, and they've tied that intersectional approach into the recommendations, which I think is absolutely key. And I think what especially stood out for me as well was the way that they'd amplified the impacts of Brexit and all of those you know, complications that have arisen out of the, you know, the settlement scheme, and how that's been, you know, managed by the government, and those opportunities there to be missed and to slip through the net. And I think social workers won't be thinking, you know, necessarily, they won't be thinking about Brexit and the impact. And again, as educators, you know, we're trying to support them to take an intersectional lens, but I think the way that the accessible way that it's been set out in this report, I think is absolutely, you know, vital and important, that accessibility of it. And I think the other thing that it comes back to what Rosa's been saying. I was really moved by the testimonies, by the voices of Roma families, and it takes courage, doesn't it, to take part in research like this, you know, when we are talking about, you know, such deeply sensitive matters that involve, you know, intergenerational trauma. So I think, you know, their bravery came out in those testimonies, and I found them really moving. And I think for social workers, you know, we can talk about data, the importance of data and research, and the problems of it not being there, but I think for social workers, they're moved by stories, aren't they? They need to hear people's stories. So I think the way that testimony and stories were captured in the research and the report, I thought was really moving.
Thank you, Alison. Thank you very much. And Theresia, welcome. Theresia, I'm going to just go to Margaret and then give you a minute, and then I'm going to come back to you as you've just joined us. So Margaret, obviously you've been inside the research team, but looking back on the work now, what are you thinking about? What's uppermost in your mind?
Thank you. Yes, I mean, obviously, when you're so embedded in it, right from the beginning of early conversations, even before we obtained funding, it's quite hard to step back a little bit and be reflective. But I think for me, it's been really, really important we brought together the legal stance. And as I sort of said earlier, I started off as a lawyer before I became a policy specialist. And I think often law is forgotten. You know, it's a key element, and it's almost like we look at social workers' practices, go, and often, and I've got immense sympathy for social workers who are really under the spotlight so much, you know, and I really want to flag up the amazing work of Alison and colleagues as well. But we don't look at lawyers, and I think it's very easy when you're sort of on this treadmill, shall we say, and think I can't be an expert with every community. Now, it's a long time ago since I practiced, and I was fortunate maybe things weren't quite specialised and we had better legal aid at that point. But I think hearing from lawyers about the challenges they face is really important. Hearing very much the professional stance. Now, I'm not for 1 minute ignoring those incredibly grueling and powerful experiences of community members, which we're really grateful we heard, but I think we often do not hear the voices of professionals, and we don't hear about the challenges they face. So being able to, it's not exactly triangulation because there are so many elements, but I will use the term triangulation and bring it all together into dialogue has been hugely important, and I'm really grateful to be able to be involved in this study.
Thank you, Margaret. Thank you. Teresia, I'm not quite sure whether your technology is working or not. Can you hear me? Your mic is actually off. I'm not sure you can hear me. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move on and see if Teresia can join us again in a minute, but I'm going to move on to the other panel members and ask you, I'm going to take you to the recommendations. So Rosa, you referred to the recommendations here saying this is kind of a hard-hitting report, but actually the recommendations do, you know, they do shine a light, and they do chart a path forward, a more positive path forward. So I just want to ask you, I'm going to shuffle the order a bit here, and just ask you, in terms of those recommendations, which is your priority? And, you know, what do you see as either facilitating or standing in the way of change? So Alison, if I come to you first, in terms of the recommendations, and if you can't remember them, we can get Joanna to put them back up.
I think we need that Roma inclusion strategy.
Yes.
I think that's the I think that would be the #1 priority, because everything flows from there. So if we have that strategy, and again, what I would like to see in a strategy which is distinct from the European Union is that there would be a pillar, a social care pillar, and that's missing. And I think that's really problematic in terms of the Roma inclusion strategy in the European Union. So for me, it's a strategy. I think, you know, that would incorporate then, you know, that data, how data is captured, that centralization of data, disaggregation of data. So for me, the #1 priority is that strategy. I think in terms of what the barriers might be, I think it's political will. Yes. I think it's political will. I think, you know, although we now have a Labour government, you know, there's that you know, lurch to the right, which concerns me deeply. So I think political will is the barrier to achieving that strategy. Okay. And why this report is so important as a lever.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you, Alison. That's really helpful. Rosa, in terms of those recommendations, I mean, I agree with you, Alison, that Roma inclusion strategy feels like, you know, it's kind of overarching, isn't it? Rosa, do you want to add to that, or sort of throw the spotlight on any more of those recommendations?
I really appreciated how, I mean, I can't now remember. I feel like the bad student who didn't do her homework. The recommendations right now. But I will say something that resonated with me was this idea that there's already a blueprint, and that blueprint, because I think, you know, it's important to remember that a lot of work in different ways with Roma families has already happened, and we don't need to start from the very beginning, but we do need to situate ourselves with that. And there is a blueprint that exists, and we could resurrect that. So that would be, I think, something alongside what Alison said with political will, and also to highlight that you can, you know, the series of recommendations were in a way.
We're losing Rosa. But I think what Rosa's saying about in a sense, this report is adding to a body of knowledge, you know, which is incredibly important. It's not that we're starting from scratch, but actually there's now a kind of serious body of knowledge which directs us and steers the way forward. Okay, Rosa, I'm going to leave you for a minute. I think we're all suffering today with some freezing internets. And Theresia, welcome. At the end of the presentation, Joanna set out a number of recommendations for change. Off the top of your head, Theresia, what do you think? What would be your recommendation for change? What do you think really needs to happen to improve the experiences of Roma families in our public services, in our children's services? What needs to change?
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Right, so today's been a really crazy day with the tech. I don't know what's happening here. But for those who don't know me, I am Theresia Rostas. I'm from the Gabor community. I have graduated in law and I have a postgraduate certificate also in education. And the main reason why I've done that was to be able to start with an organization called Care for Young People's Future, which offered alternative education for children in care. And with the virtual school. Care for Young People's Future was founded in 2019. But prior to that, I've worked for about 10 years in inclusion and learning services. So all the newly arrived families, Roma families, European families were coming to see me to access education, to access support with housing and so on. The tricky bit and the difficult and the sad part was that with my other hat as an interpreter, as a court interpreter, as an advisor to the police and to Kafkas and so many other organizations, I was seeing the same families a year later with social services in court. And this is how Care for Young People's Future was born. And everything what I've done with Dada together, whether it was, you know, getting Roma families in the focus groups, whether it was consultation, it's my life. Like day and night I live by thinking that this is the only way to bring social justice and to ensure that human rights are not being violated because of someone's cultural background. So everything what I do is related to the cultural to the protected characteristics that we all are good to recognize on paper, but actually in reality sometimes this changes people's lives. So everything what we've seen as recommendation in the report that was put together, you know, by different academics, universities, and including us, because we had a voice in this report. Yes. And not only as a Roma community members, but we are also academics. We are also, you know, we have lived experience, and so probably more than 15 years for me to witness how children forcibly have been removed from the Roma parents' houses, and how I was called maybe midnight to go as an emergency interpreter in court, or how newborn babies were taken away from their mothers' breasts, on stereotypes. I have seen cases that where the Roma children had to be taken into care to have a better life, but I have seen a much bigger percentage of Roma children that were taken into court purely on discrimination. And because of the fact that they didn't took into consideration their cultural characteristics, and they breached their own procedures, like, and that takes me to systemic racism, which is highlighted in the report as well. Yeah. Yes. So everything what we talk about, recommendations, cultural awareness, if we don't also think bigger and we go towards the parliament and we think about creating an act that will support the rights of the GRT children, yes, in social services, we're not pushing it as much as we can. So as we speak, I finalized writing a chapter which looks at human rights in social work paradigm. Yes. And it's going to be probably published by the end of this year. Is Bristol University who's going to publish it, but that chapter is not just that book itself is not just about the Roma community. It's about marginalized communities that suffer from human rights violations or inequalities when it comes to social work services. Yeah. So that chapter is being co-written by myself and Phil. And in that chapter, you are able to see some personal reflections on some of the cases that I was heavily involved recently. We all know about which cases we're talking. And the things that need to be changed and how each of us play a role to make sure that we highlight the inequalities, whether you are an academic, whether you are a community person, whether you are a lawyer or professional involved into anything related to social work context. And so this report again emphasizes the importance of taking our mandate and commitment into serious, within your organization. When you are a social worker, you legally you are saying that actually you will make your best to get to know the cultural characteristics of every single family that will become your case. And this is not always the case. We have social workers that have no idea about the Roma culture, and they keep on confusing it with the Romanian community. We have social workers that are influencing decisions of the other institutions involved, whether it's the police, whether it's the health, the hospital, and that takes us to systemic racism. Because when institutions trust each other and they don't keep themselves accountable, and only because the first institution starts to say, oh, they seem to me aggressive, they were loud, they didn't, and that's the first suspicion. You get a report from the hospital, you get the police involved, the police writes a report with already having some stereotypes from the other institutions, they go hand in hand, they trust each other. Then you have the social worker doing the assessments, which already brings a lot of stereotypes, and they're not thinking impartial. By looking at the language that is written in the reports, you can tell, and I personally have seen the language and the way that these families have been described. There was nothing positive written about families that had zero history with the police, that had zero history with neglect and things like that.
Yes, thank you, Teresa. That was a very, very passionate depiction of what is clearly, multiple instances of systemic discrimination, racism, and, as you say, complete misunderstanding and complete ignorance, really, about migrant populations within children's services, which I think I've seen there's lots of discussion in the chat, which I want to pick up on. But yeah, thank you, Teresa. Great contribution. So, Margaret, I'm just going to come to you finally on the point of recommendations. We've got lots of questions.
Don't worry, I'll keep it short and punchy.
Yeah.
Okay, so colleagues have already said a lot of really important points.
Yeah.
I mean, I think for me there's two levels. I mean, one, we're looking at sort of top level policy, aren't we? We're looking at things around sort of austerity. I hate that term. I mean, let's call it out. Let's say what it is. It's actually starving funds from often larger families who need more support, who need better housing. So I think there's one thing there with that sort of high level, which cuts across many aspects, because we know so many referrals are to do with people experiencing, poverty, food hunger, accommodation. We need to do that. We need to talk about solidarity very much. But I think the thing that, as some of you will know, I've been working on a lot with many people here in this room is around the gypsy travel, and I apologise immediately for them all being collated, and that's another policy debate. But the pledge, the higher education pledge, to bring communities into higher education, to develop and bring forward those people we were looking at the amazing people on this panel here who are members of the communities, who are highly skilled and professionals, to bring people into universities, to train people up. But also, I think we really need to be learning those lessons, as Rosa said, that blueprint. We're talking about other minoritized communities. We have the educational tools which are embedded in training. Let's start talking about the communities that here we're speaking about today, have those experiences, that knowledge embedded, whether you're a lawyer, a medic, which is something we do a lot of in medical school, you're a social worker, whoever you are dealing with people's lives, and it's a privilege and it's terrifying, and you've got to get it right. That's it for me.
Thank you, Margaret. Thank you. Thank you. Last but not least, very, very powerful points made. Right, so I'm now going to open up. We've got a number of questions in the Q&A chat. Sophie, do you want me to select these, or have you selected?
I've selected a handful. I think we might be able to get through all of them, and a couple of them are very similar, so they combine together. Brilliant, as well.
Sophie, that's great. So what I'm going to do then, Sophie, is ask you to put a question to the panel, but also to the wider research team. And perhaps if panel members and the wider research team raise their hand if they feel they can, and I'll bring you in. Okay, Sophie, fire away.
Perfect. So our first question has been raised by two people. So it's been raised by Lisa and it's been raised by Philip. And broadly, one of the question is what can we do as social work educators? And the other one by Philip is sort of broadly thinking about the idea of teaching cultural competency to social work students and also CPD hours. So kind of unconscious bias training to students and practitioners. And what can we do about that?
That's such an important question. So panel members, wider research team, yes, Alison, go ahead.
I think what we have to do as a matter of priority is to make anti-racism a mandatory core element of social work training. It's not. You know, it simply isn't. It's ad hoc at best. And then, you know, when it comes to, specific, distinct areas of anti-racism like anti-gypsyism and anti-traveller racism, then again, the chances that you will ever encounter it in your social work training again is just completely, ad hoc. If you have a lecturer who has a particular interest, then they might integrate it into your training. So again, when we're thinking about, and I think this goes to decolonization of the social work curricula as well. So we need to decolonize through a Gypsy and Traveller Roma lens, because that's missing. And we need to make, anti-racism a core, a mandatory part of social worker. First of all, the pre-qualifying, but the post-qualifying as well. It needs to be a mandatory element of that. So that's kind of, I'm sure other members will want to come in, but there's a starter for 10.
Yeah, and it's a good starter for 10, Alison. Yeah, really good point. As you say, that anti-racism training education shouldn't be left to the kind of ad hoc interests of particular members of staff. Completely agree with you. Simona, I don't know you, but you've got your hand up. Did you want to add something here? Yes. Yeah, do you want to put something in the chat, Simona, or do you want to come in?
I don't think Simona is participant.
Hello.
Oh, no, Simona is a participant. It's just she's got a hand up, so I thought, well, I'll ask you if you want to.
No, I was just going to say, I'm not sure if she's technically able to, but she is, so I'll let her speak.
Hello, Tia. Hello, good afternoon, all of you. I will also introduce myself, who I am. First of all, I'm Simona Lisa, and I'm a CEO of a charity based in Ipswich in Suffolk, named Union Romani Voice. As my background, I have a qualification in social work outside of UK in Romania. I am Roma from Romania, and I live in UK more than 10 years. Okay, my background experience is in education department and also social services department, and working as a CEO in a Roma organization and working with the public, actually practically, face to face with the Roma community. One of the high issue is that is lack of communication between local authorities and families, and also stereotypes between both sides, Roma community and the other side, local authorities. As a recommendation, in my experience, we have to avoid any cases to go ahead. For example, they believe that is forced marriage when a girl leave education before 16 years old, and we have a few cases, for example, in Ipswich. As a recommendation, we have to avoid that to go to open a case, and I would like the local authorities, which can be first school, before to send it to social services, to get in touch with the family, with, for example, Roma advocate, to find out what is the issue, not to just send it over to social services, child protection, and saying that is a forced marriage. For example, what we done in Ipswich, we avoid that straight away when the family get in touch with us. But we have many cases around UK when the family they're not aware of the law, they're not aware of the act and all the legal process, and they just, as my previous speaker speak, saying that they open a case and there's no communication in both sides. However, that unfortunately, the last part is when the children they are removed by force. How to avoid that? As you said before, it's not a clear policy in each district. We don't have a strong policy. Each social services locally or nationally, we don't have. It's a missing understanding between Romanian and Roma community.
Yes.
However, recommendation is all the social workers who choose to stand up as a social worker, to have up-to-date training about culture, one
Yes.
side, and the other side is the engagement and build capacity with school and families. That will be my recommendation.
Okay. Thank you.
Avoid.
Simona, thank you very much for that. We've taken note of that. I'm just cutting you off a little bit just because we're a bit short of time. We've got quite a few other questions, but I think again you're touching on a number of really important points that have been made in this webinar so far about, you know, not jumping to assumptions about communities, and also the kind of unhelpfulness of the sort of sledgehammer of local authorities in relation to what they might perceive as forced marriage, etc. So Simona, if you don't mind, we will come back to you, but thank you for that contribution. And it brings us really nicely, Sophie, I think, on to your next question.
It does, yeah. Thank you so much for raising those important points and for sharing your experiences. And so one of the questions we've had in the chat is, how do you envisage legal empowerment of Roma communities, and how do we combat legal disadvantage? And I can see Dada's got a hand up already for this one.
Great, Dada, come in.
Okay, so because I've done a bit of work on that, and I have a little bit of idea, you know. So I think in different ways. One is community empowerment. We've been working with community organizations, working with Roma in this context, with community champions, with community activists, and so that is one way in, because a lot of Roma families that are, you know, going through this process are often extremely disadvantaged. And so they need that sort of support from intermediaries. And so their legal empowerment is the key to legal empowerment of parents. Yeah. And then once they are sort of learning about this process, that information is very quickly spreading inside of the communities through word of mouth, as we have seen in our discussion groups. Yes. But I want to also say another element of this is for legal specialists to be aware of the disadvantages that Roma families have when going through the legal processes such as this one. And to be acutely aware of that. So by that I mean like lawyers and I mean the judges and all the, you know, professionals like people from Kafka's and legal guardians and so on, everybody involved in this legal process, to be aware of the disadvantages that parents might have in this process and to actually try to make this process meaningful for them. Because 9 out of 10, if not 10 out of 10, Roma parents going through child protection process have no idea what lays ahead of them and what is at stake. And so, you know, it's really important that social workers and other professionals, including legal professionals, take active part in this and try and accommodate that and try and make an effort to explain the processes to Roma families. So I'm going to stop here. Maybe someone else wants to say something else.
Thank you, Dada. I think you've really highlighted extremely well the issue of legal disadvantage and the fact that, it is incumbent on the professionals to increase their awareness of that and proactively take steps to combat that huge glaring legal disadvantage that was described by the research team. Okay, so I've got two people here, and I'm going to come, Melanie, to you first in the internal team, and then Daniel. Can I ask if you just keep responses fairly brief, because we've got a number of questions we'd like to touch on, and we've got about 15 minutes left. So, Melanie, on legal disadvantage, legal empowerment.
Oh, sorry, my hand has accidentally gone up. I shall pass that over to Daniel.
Daniel. Hi, Daniel.
Hi, guys. Good afternoon, everybody. So yeah, I'm just going to MC through it as fast as I can, because I know you're tight for time. I am the head of services at our Roma-led organisation, Connecting Roma. We're a community interest company. We do a lot of projects, programs, as you can imagine, to empower the communities and, bring the voice there and everything else, including research. But the heart of Connecting Roma is our Roma advocacy that we have contracted with Bradford District. And predominantly we work in West Yorkshire. So we take on cases all the way from child in need to, of course, the court arena. And I was emotional during this presentation because it finally felt like we've got people behind us. It felt like we was alone in the world as an organization working with this, and we've only managed to turn to Denise. So I know Denise, and she's helped us throughout all of these years, so she knows what we've been up to, including Teresa. And you hear these reflections, and you hear this passion with these professionals, because we facing it firsthand what these families are experiencing. So yeah, absolutely well done to the team. I just wanted to update you guys quickly. I agree with all the recommendations, especially what has been said in the chat in regards to the Roma strategy. But it's just been difficult because we are at the point where we say stuff it, because I heard the barrier will be in regards to policy and political barriers. It's all right. And we said stuff it as an organization. We're putting ourselves out there. We're trying to unite Roma organizations across Britain and just kind of, get this strategy going. So I'm very, very, again, happy to hear that these recommendations are coming from here. And yeah, we just hope that, of course, we can connect, broader and support you guys as much as possible. So good to see that we've got a gang here, and yeah, we absolutely love to be part of it. So we hope to connect with you guys after, and thank you so much. We've got advocates on here as well. So the next team meeting will hopefully be more valuable, as I can see there's more of it. I was telling you the truth. I wasn't just making it up. So thank you so much, guys.
Thanks, Daniel. And I'm sure people on this call would love to connect with you and hear more about the kick and the advocacy work you're doing. Certainly, I'd love to hear more about that. But I'm going to turn now to Alison and then to Joanna.
Just very, very quickly, Karen, on legal empowerment. So I really support what Dada is saying about the importance of empowering Roma champions and community activists. But I think we also need to have those difficult conversations about racism, which is embedded, which is baked into the judicial system. So we need to tackle racism, anti-Gypsyism within the judiciary. So it's that intersectional approach, isn't it? Approaching things things at multiple levels. And again, this is where I think, you know, an overarching strategy is so important. But there is a lot of important work happening around racial inequalities within the family justice system, and the Romani and the Traveller Social Work Association is connected in with that, because like I said, I think it needs to be tackled at all of those levels.
Yeah, Alison, thank you very much. Joanna?
And I just want to add very quickly, well, first of all, thank you, Daniel, and please stay connected, because, you know, if we're going to do something, it's we need to stay together, and we need to build a force, and we need to mobilize, and we need to stay connected and share resources, share tools, share experiences. And I'm also a little emotional, because it's just so great to hear Romani voices out there, and the passion and the struggle that that keeps on going. But I just want to very quickly talk about education, and I'm absolutely in agreement that we need anti-racist education, not a module, not a course, not a one you know, webinar. We need to embed anti-racist education through everything that we do, through child support, through adult social care, and we as educators need to do that better. But we also have to make sure that the placements we offer are anti-racist, because a lot of the time what happens, we teach lovely theory and you know, lovely ideas, and then students go on placement and don't see these ideas embedded in the institutions they work for. And that's not just social work, that's healthcare, that's policing, that's any sort of organization that takes part in providing for social well-being and social cohesion. So you know, this is I don't have any answers yet, but I think that should be the main sort of point of social work education, to be meaningfully anti-racist in all its manifestations and retributions to the communities we live in. Thanks.
Thank you, Joanna. I completely agree with you on that. So Margaret, over to you.
And again, I'll try and keep it quick. So I think a lot of the things, I mean, I'm fully in agreement with what, you know, collaborators, partners, speakers have said. And I also put in something in the chat about education. I think as well, we really can't underestimate the importance of having role models. So I'm back on that one again, people from the community, supporting people to be able to self-identify, because we all know a lot of people hide their identity. Thankfully, that's changing, I hope, as more people come out, but having that opportunity. The other one actually I want to say, it's almost more of a question, maybe, which is going to be a bit complicated. We've now just started to see family law becoming, you know, public, you know, reported on. I'm not entirely sure how I feel about that. And I'm actually thinking, is that going to potentially stigmatise some populations more, or is it going to open up greater dialogue and understanding? So I don't know if that's something I want to reflect on. So I'm just steering it away a bit, but I'm just thinking about it, you know, justice needs to be done, but it also needs to be seen to be done. And maybe it opens those cracks, those fissures, so people can actually say, would you treat a family from another community in the way you're treating this community? So I'm going to park that, but I sort of wanted to throw it out there really as a thought.
It's a really good question, Margaret, just to respond quickly, because the transparency debate in family justice has been, you know, it's been ongoing for a long time, with proponents on both sides of the coin, particularly I think people concerned about the position of children. However, because family justice judgments have traditionally taken place behind closed doors, it clearly renders minority populations extremely vulnerable, who don't have avenues, don't often have avenues to exercise their rights and entitlements. I mean, I think listening today, issues of rights and entitlements have to be absolutely at the heart of an inclusion agenda. And, you know, too easily we're seeing the rights of marginalised populations, poor populations, but in particular populations who occupy interlocking categories of disadvantaged rights we ride roughshod over them, and it's become routine. Okay, so I think let's watch what happens with opening up family court cases. It's been a long battle to get to this point, and I don't think as yet we're sure about the kind of intended and unintended outcomes. So it's a good point that you raised, Margaret. Okay, so have we got a final question, Sophie, before we wrap up?
Yes, we've got a final question. So we've got one that's going to be very brief, and that's from Sunil. And then we've got one which I think will be a wider discussion. So quickly, Sunil says, do you have a bank of experts for court from Roma community whose expertise local authorities can utilise in care proceedings pre-proceedings or outside of proceedings? So that's a very sort of practical, functional question. And then the more larger question we have is, and this touches on what Joanna and others have seen and what the communities themselves have said in the judgments. How far do Roma families feel the stigma and experiences of poverty, poor housing repeat the experiences they were fleeing from? And I suppose that means in the countries that they've migrated from.
Okay, so let's just go to that first question about a bank of experts. I mean, it seems to me like an incredibly helpful, practical suggestion. Rosa.
Yes, I think it's a small bank of people, but I think that that's changing with time and as more and more people self-identify publicly. And, you know, I know Teresa and I have done a lot of work supporting several authorities, organizations, hospitals, police. And there is also an assumption that we should be very grateful that you're asking us to support them, but no budget, no honoring of our time and expertise comes with that ask. So it's a real tricky one because of course I want to help, of course I want to support, but there is something there where, again, it goes back to that institutionalized racism where some communities or some some experiences are celebrated or honored in one way more than others. So that would be my saying, like, yes, there are people there, but also what are organizations willing to do to support those advocates and those individuals who can support you in doing your job better. Because we've invested in our education and there's so many barriers we've had to overcome, and that lived experience is valuable. And that's why, we've learned to code, I can speak for myself. I've learned to code switch and speak and use this language. And then I can go back to a family and connect and be with my community. And that is the power, the gift, and the difficulty that's all mixed in there. So that would be from my perspective, yes. And what is the organization? How are they willing to invest in that bank of experts?
Yeah, that's right, Rosa. And I think that's a really fundamental point to note about how do we put experts on an equal footing rather than having certain privileged experts and others who we expect their labour to be gifted freely forever. Alison, over to you.
Again, I think, as Rosa says, there's a growing bank of people, but for all the reasons we've been talking about, it's still quite a small bank of people. And if I think about us in the Romani and Traveller Social Work Association, those of us who are members of community, we get bombarded, because we're community members, but we're also social workers, we're professional social workers, we're skilled in child protection. So literally we get bombarded. We cannot meet the demands that come our way. And also there's the lack of, as Rosa was saying, there's the lack of acknowledgement that, these are our lived and our living experiences. We have direct experiences of child removal in our families, and we're still living with the trauma of that. So these organisations, it can be so distressing, and we burn out. So we go through cycles where we have the energy, because then again, this is all over and above the day job.
Yes.
We're doing this because it's so important. The removal of the removal of our children, from cultural and ethnic identity, it's the most significant act that the state can do. So it's an act of violence, isn't it? Cultural violence. So I think there really needs to be consideration as well in how we support community members who are occupying these really, really, really important roles, given the trauma, the intergenerational trauma that we carry.
Yeah, Alison, that's such an important point, and I think such a point for us to stop and just round off. But yeah, the points you make, I think, are absolutely fundamental, really. I'm really pleased that we're recording this webinar, Joanna, because I feel like I want to go back and listen again to these incredibly
Yes, we are. Yeah, it's all recorded.
Learning. Okay, that's great. Okay, look, we've got a couple of minutes left, so I'm just going to round off. And Sophie, I'm sorry we couldn't get to the second half of that question, but what we're going to do is gather up the questions, respond as a group to them, and then send out a single email, Joanna, with some of the answers and some of the points and some resources. It feels like this is a sort of start of a conversation, Joanna, though, and we need to kind of pick up some of this as a series of actions as well. How do we support that?
This was always meant as a first step, this report, and it's so great to see the wonderful work. So please stay connected, and please give us your voices, and please support all of us working in this film, but particularly people with lived experience who put up such a big fight against all the odds that, you know, like these are the proper champions of
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. So in the chat, Sophie's just put like a little quick feedback. If you could just give us a bit of feedback from the session, it's always helpful for us in terms of setting these things up. I just wanted to say that obviously we will make the slides, the recording available through the Centre for Child and Family Justice Research at Lancaster University, and also through partner organisations where that's possible. But I think this is a phenomenal resource for us all. I think, you know, we've learned so much. I just also want to say that we've got another event in May, the next event in our Global Innovation Series, and that will be focused on supporting families at birth, global perspective. So, Teresa, I saw you a minute ago, Teresa, and now you have disappeared, but I really picked up on the point you made about the removal of babies at birth, and I think Rosa and other people have made that point. We'll be bringing together a global conversation about this, because obviously this is an issue that affects many marginalised communities, Indigenous people, First Nation people, people living in poverty, disabled parents, etc. So that'll be the next in our series. We will invite you all again to join. We will see if any of you want to speak and contribute your experience. Absolutely fantastic event today. Thank you so much to all of our speakers. Thanks to Joanna for organising this. All that meticulous planning and details really paid off. And if you have any queries or questions, we have in the chat now our CFJ email link. Please do follow up with us through that link. But otherwise, thank you very much. And I've really enjoyed convening this and meeting you all. It's been a thoroughly enriching learning
experience. And very quickly, thank you, Karen, for the wonderful job. Thank you for all the speakers. And most importantly, thank you for our technical colleagues who are helping with technical issues, Bashard and Linda. Without them, I would have a heart attack. So thank you very much for a lovely conversation. And please, let's keep talking. Thank you.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you to everybody. And we hope to see you again soon.